Today we're going to practice evaluating the main tool used when addressing groups, the voice. There are three main elements that combine to create either a positive or negative experience for listeners. They can result in a voice that is pleasing to listen to and can be used effectively, or they can create a voice that doesn't hold attention, or even worse, causes an adverse reaction. The three elements are volume, pitch, and pace. When evaluating volume, keep in mind that a good speaker will adjust to the size of both the room and the audience. Of course, with an amplifying device like a microphone, the speaker can use a natural tone. But speakers should not be dependent on microphones. A good speaker can speak loudly without shouting. The second element, pitch, is related to the highness or lowness of the sounds. High pitches are, for most people, more difficult to listen to. So in general, speakers should use the lower registers of their voice. During a presentation, it's important to vary pitch to some extent in order to maintain interest. The third element, pace, that is how fast or slow words and sounds are articulated, should also be varied. A slower pace can be used to emphasize important points. Note that the time spent not speaking can be meaningful too. Pauses ought to be used to signal transitions or create anticipation. Because a pause gives the listener time to think about what was just said, or even to predict what might come next, it can be very effective when moving from one topic to another. What I'd like you to do now is watch and listen to a videotape, and use the forms I gave you to rate the speaking voices you hear. Then tonight, I want you to go home and read a passage into a tape recorder and evaluate your own voice.
All right. So, for example, now this is interesting. If your eyeballs are in the front of your face, you're seeing things. The part of the brain that lights up when you see something is actually back here. All right. So if you actually were watching, like in my class, I'm sure the PowerPoints are to die for, and so the part of the brain that's activated at that moment is way back there. If I'm giving the speech of a lifetime and my students are like, more, I'm like, this is the part of the brain that lights up, for example. I mean, I'm just sort of characterizing it here. Interestingly enough, if that's all you did, you're lecturing, you're giving presentations, that's it. There's a whole bunch of other areas of the brain that does not tend to get activated if all you're really doing is the kind of traditional didactic approach. Now, there are other senses, okay? There's other kinds of senses, and if processing was involved, then the signal kind of spreads out further and further. There's classifications of the part of the cortex. There's deeper areas of the brain, by the way, but we're just looking at the surface, which is where the highest cognitive functions are kind of showing up. But you've got vision processing back here. You've got sound processing back here. There's a kind of a giant swath there that will deal with sensory perceptions, dealing with touch. Smells tend to be directly kind of on the undersurface, out of the way. It's a very old part of the cortex underneath there. And yet we only sort of channel stuff into those areas, which seems extremely kind of narrow focused.
Some years ago, a group of academics from different disciplines recognized the necessity of studying conflict as a phenomenon. They were interested in the distinct properties of conflict as it occurred in international relations, national politics, industrial relations, communities, or even in the domestic setting. These academics believed that approaches from different disciplines could be applied to the study of conflict with a view to better understanding its causes, effects, and solutions. As a result, research groups developed, and universities and academic journals began to publish papers on conflict theory, as it came to be called. Unfortunately, many other academics didn't welcome this new discipline. They couldn't reconcile it with traditional scholarly practices because it had both a practical nature and an analytical approach. Nevertheless, the new discipline continued to develop, and the field grew and spread, and conflict theory now has the same prestige as other academic areas of research and study, despite the early criticism it attracted.
This is a bomb calorimeter. This is the actual piece of equipment that researchers use to calculate the energy content of either biodiesel or maybe even the potato chips that you had for lunch today. When they calculate the amount of energy, they're going to calculate it in heat units, which would either be joules or calories. I want you to look inside the bomb calorimeter. Inside here, you can see that there's a silver bucket. Water goes all in here. And this is actually the bomb. It's a smaller silver cylinder. What you do is put your fuel sample in there. Then, these two electrodes are connected to the bomb. These provide the spark that will ignite your sample. When your sample burns or combusts, that gives off energy. So how is the energy collected, or how does a scientist figure out how much energy is being given off? Well, it's a closed system. There's a lid here that goes on top of this calorimeter. And what's in here in the lid is a stirrer. The stirrer is going to stir the water that's in this big pool here, so that the heat given off from the sample is going to warm the water in a uniform way. This is the temperature probe. This goes down in the water also and measures the change in temperature, because as the sample is burned, it'll give off heat and the temperature of the water will increase. So the lid goes on, the sample is prepared. The last thing that you need to make a combustion reaction happen is oxygen. And at some point during the process, some oxygen is added by a tank that's connected to the calorimeter here. So we are going to burn a sample of the biodiesel that you've prepared and get some feedback on the energy content of it. You'll be able to use this to compare it to petroleum-based fuels like octane.
Before we start our first lab, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the workbook we'll be using. The first thing I'd like to point out is that the workbook contains a very large amount of material, far more than you could ever handle in a single semester. What you're supposed to do is choose the experiments and activities that you want to do, within a certain framework, of course. Part of my job is to help you make your choices. Next, I'd like to mention that in each workbook chapter, there are usually 2 subsections. The first is called Experiments, and the second is called Activities. In the Experiments section, the workbook gives full instructions for all the experiments, including alternate procedures. Choose the procedure you wish. There's plenty of equipment available. In the Activities section, you will find suggestions for projects that you can do on your own time. You'll see that there are usually no detailed instructions for the activities. You're supposed to do them your own way. If there are no questions, let's turn to Chapter 1 now.
This week I'd like to start by talking a bit about electric vehicles. Although we tend to think of electric cars as being something completely modern, they were in fact some of the earliest types of motorized vehicle. At the beginning of the 20th century, electric cars were actually more popular than cars with an internal combustion engine, as they were more comfortable to ride in. However, as cars fueled by petrol increased in importance, electric cars declined. The situation became such that electric vehicles were only used for certain specific purposes, as forklift trucks, ambulances, and urban delivery vehicles, for example. Although electricity declined in use in road vehicles, it steadily grew in importance as a means of powering trains. Switzerland, for example, was quick to develop an electrified train system, encouraged in this, no doubt, by the fact that it had no coal or oil resources of its own. Nowadays, there is renewed interest in electricity as a means of powering road vehicles. Why is this the case? Well, undoubtedly, economic reasons are of considerable importance. The cost of oil has risen so sharply that there is a strong financial imperative to look for an alternative. However, there are also environmental motivations. Emissions from cars are blamed in large part for, among other things, the destruction of the ozone layer and the resultant rise in temperatures in the polar regions. A desire not to let things get any worse is also encouraging research into designing effective electric transport.
The brand is the talent. And let's stick with that sports analogy. The answer is you can spend $450 million on a stadium, but if over a 10-year period the player talent's no good and there are more losses than there are wins, there are going to be a lot more empty seats than there are full ones, right? No matter how good the marketing is, no matter how beautiful the stadium is. The brand is the talent. Benison Biederman again. The leaders of great groups love talent and know where to find it. They revel in the talent of others. Only in the stupid world of business and government do we promote the best accountant to the head of the accounting department, the best salesman to the head of the sales department, the best trainer to the head of the training department. You don't do that in sports, right? The definition of most of our coaches at the professional level is they were second-rate or marginal players who were brilliant students of the game and people. That is, they were good. What are leaders good at doing? Leading. There was a guy when I was a kid, Yale University used to win the NCAA swimming championships year after year after year. And I've never seen this proven, but it sure doesn't surprise me. There was an interesting thing about their coach. He couldn't swim, but he could sure as heck motivate swimmers. And that's the point, isn't it? There's a thing called leadership.
The green economy could easily be the next industrial revolution. I mean, energy is, we all need energy. We do an annual report which studies how much oil is left in the world and demand for oil. And with China, India, South America, Africa even, growing at the rate they're now growing, we think about 4 or 5 years from now the demand for fuels will exceed supply. That could push, prices through the roof. And for that reason, if forget global warming for 1 minute, just for that reason alone, we should be hurrying up, saving on energy and creating alternative sources of energy. And I think those people who invest in this sector, hopefully, will get their thanks. And get their just return.
Welcome to today's lesson. We are continuing with our study of taxonomy. Taxonomy is how scientists classify organisms into different groups based on the characteristics that they share. So, for instance, a good way to think about taxonomy is the U.S. Postal Service. If we want to send a letter to someone, we first start off by addressing it to the nation they're in. By default, we usually assume that's America, but it doesn't have to be. It could be England or Costa Rica or Spain. You put their nation or their kingdom. Then within that kingdom, you address it to a slightly more specific level, their state. So for instance, South Carolina would be the same as a phylum. Then within that state, you would address it to their city, and then to their street number, the street they live on. Then you would address it to, say, their apartment complex, and within that complex, you'd address it by their last name to their family, and then finally their first name to the specific person you want to get it to. And in that way, we're able to weed out all the 400 million people we don't want to send our letter to in America and pinpoint the exact person we want the letter to reach. And in the same way, scientists use a taxonomy chart to pinpoint a living creature, an organism, and how it relates to everything else in the world.
But we can really thank the Great Exhibition of 1851 for giving us the world's premier taxi service. For it was going through this exhibition, this fabulous exhibition of inventions from all around the four corners of the empire, that the visitors were appalled, dismayed and vexed by their journeys to this exhibition, because the cabbies of the day in their horse-drawn carts were absolutely terrible, could not find their way to this exhibition. And so, at great public outcry, the London authorities set up the Public Carriage Office, which is an organisation that still exists, and you can take a short walk to Penton Street up the road. And this Public Carriage Office took on the responsibility of licensing all major taxi drivers in London. All taxi drivers from 1851 onwards had to pass what is now known as the London Knowledge. This phenomenal knowledge of London. What is the London Knowledge? It's the ability to remember the 25,000 streets, how they're all interconnected, and know all the main arterial roads in and out of London. Cabbies need to know all this, plus 1,000 points of specific interest, cafes, bars, public offices. They need to know them all as part of their training.
In an article that you wrote that I just read, you said you wished you could take everyone back to decades ago to look at the Florida Keys.
50 years ago, think about how much change has taken place in that short period of time. We have managed to consume on the order of 90% of the big fish in the ocean, the tunas, the swordfish, the sharks. They're mostly gone. Until recently, people have had the belief that there isn't much we puny human beings could do to change the nature of the ocean, but in fact, we have, not just because of what we've been taking out, and the destructive means often applied to take fish and other creatures from the sea, but also what we're putting into the sea, either directly or what we put into the atmosphere that falls back into the sea.
So if you were going to give a grade on the health of the oceans today, what would it be?
Well, it depends on which aspect. Across the board, the oceans are in trouble. It's hard for me to assign a specific grade, maybe C-.
I think one of the things that's confusing for people is when they come here is there appear to be hundreds and hundreds of rules, hundreds of things you should and shouldn't do. And the truth of it is most of them are about class. And lots of them are tripwires, actually, for people who don't know them. So what I tried to do in my book was take it back to some sort of first principle and say, look, there are anthropological reasons why we have certain kinds of manners. So I'll give you a very good example. In Britain, there are sort of two ways of holding a knife very broadly. And broadly speaking, the middle classes hold it with the index finger on the top, gripped in the hand, and working class people hold it like a pen. Entirely a class distinction, and people mercilessly exploit it if they want to. The truth of it is, the one way not to hold a knife at the table is clasped in your fist, raised, as if to kill your guest. And what does that tell us about eating? Well, what it tells us about eating is two things. It's never confuse your guests with either the food or the enemy. Don't eat them and don't kill them. That's about how you should hold your knife, because actually manners are really about the reduction of violence. There's a lot in there about reducing violence. So that's just an illustration of what one tries to do. So actually, when you look at real table manners, they're about people feeling comfortable with each other, sharing food around a table. Very important human thing.
And I think
excellent. He said, innovation equals invention And let me just stop here. Innovation equals invention. Often people mistake these two things for the same thing. Innovation equals invention. They are not. Innovation is something that generates value for the world. It makes something faster, better, cheaper. It gives someone some great satisfaction. An invention is an idea, a technology, a patent. In and of itself, it does not generate value. So these two are not the same thing. And sometimes you see them interchange, and that's not correct. So innovation equals invention times commercialization. So, and when we look at this equation of innovation, something of value, it requires a new idea, and then it requires someone or some organization that is going to commercialize that idea and to make it of value to the world.
I'm just going to take on where Stafford left off. The hormone I want to talk to you about is called melatonin, and it's synthesized in the pineal gland, which is a very small, it's the size of a pea in your brain. Descartes called it the seat of the soul, and it is where melatonin is made. Is this working? And it has a rhythm as well. And in a sense, it's the opposite of cortisol. It peaks at night. We call it the darkness hormone. In every species that we've studied, melatonin occurs at night, and it's a hormone that prepares you for the things that your species does at night. So of course in humans we sleep, but animals like rodents, they're awake. So it's a hormone that is related to darkness behavior.